Serving the northeast, this is Tyne Tees Television. It's 10 o'clock on Wednesday, the 28th of August.
Mr. Gorbachev seeks strength, cracks down on the coup sympathizers. The Soviet man in London's called home to explain himself. The envoy who denounced the coup is now foreign minister. Mr. Major tells the Russians don't believe in an aid mountain. And the fraud office are asked round to help Brent Walker. Good evening. President Gorbachev began trying to reassert his authority over the Soviet Union today. He persuaded the Supreme Soviet to sack what's left of the old government because of its involvement in last week's coup. He said the cabinet could not be trusted. He sacked the leadership of the KGB. 13 leaders of the coup have been charged with high treason. If they're found guilty, they face the death penalty. Also, Mr. Gorbachev told Mr. Yeltsin and his Russian parliament not to overstep their authority. Now the coup is over, they must obey Soviet law, he said. Mr. Gorbachev appointed a new foreign minister. He's Mr. Boris Pankin, the ambassador to Czechoslovakia, the only ambassador to condemn the coup. A joint Soviet and Russian delegation has flown to the Ukrainian capital, Kiev, to try to persuade the republic to reverse its independence.
By the time Mikhail Gorbachev left the Kremlin tonight, he had engineered a sweeping counterattack against those who betrayed him. It has stripped the Soviet leadership of anyone implicated in the coup. In the Supreme Soviet, he demanded the dismissal of his entire 70-strong cabinet of ministers. I cannot have any confidence in them, he said. MPs voted overwhelmingly to carry out his wishes. The ringleaders of the coup, 7 survivors of the original group, and 6 other officials were charged with high treason. They face the death penalty. And at KGB headquarters, where the toppled statue of founder Felix Dzerzhinsky is now a symbol of the new democracy, the entire governing body was dissolved. The KGB's Lubyanka building was the ominous focus of Soviet power for more than 70 years. This is the office of its director, the nerve center of an organization which now admits killing 4 million people, a figure others put at nearly 40 million. But young KGB officers said they welcomed today's dismissals. They deserved to be sacked, said one. His colleague added, all the rank-and-file KGB people supported reform. Mr. Gorbachev told ITN the security of the country would no longer be limited to the activities of one service. And critics of the KGB said the organization should undergo sweeping change.
Well, it's only the beginning. A victory is still ahead. Victory is when the society will sigh freely and will be protected from return of this ominous power we had for 75 years. Today we are only in the initial stage, so it will take quite some time. But we have to do it fast, I say. We have to do it quickly. Otherwise they will regroup and attack back.
The former Supreme Soviet Speaker, Anatoly Lukyanov, is to be investigated for his role in the coup. I was not a conspirator, he insisted today. And many legislators are becoming uneasy about what they see as a witch hunt and a lust for revenge. The Russian people are not known for their liberal views on crime and punishment. In a recent survey, 35% said all homosexuals should be executed.
I'm afraid that under the present circumstances, the people are bloodthirsty, and therefore I'm afraid that there will be demands for most cruel sentence.
Mr. Gorbachev's other concern today was the growing influence of Boris Yeltsin. He warned his Russian parliament that it must still abide by Soviet law. Everything must be based on the constitution and cooperation. In a decree today, Mr. Yeltsin demanded all foreign exchange operations be subject to his Russian jurisdiction. And he proposed that nuclear weapons based in the Ukraine should be transferred to Russian soil if the Ukraine becomes independent. A joint delegation from the Soviet and Russian parliaments went to the Ukraine for urgent talks. Moves towards independence there have raised more alarm than in any other republic. And there's growing unrest elsewhere. This is the Azerbaijani capital, Baku, where 300,000 people took to the streets to demand that Communist Party assets be seized. The ultimate humiliation was proposed by the mayor of Moscow tonight. He said the remains of Lenin could soon be removed from the Red Square Mausoleum, the party's most sacred monument. Mr. Gorbachev has cleared the decks and is acting with renewed confidence. But he faces the mammoth task of rebuilding a Soviet leadership structure, one powerful enough to withstand the challenge from Boris Yeltsin. Tim Hewitt, News at 10, Moscow.
The Soviet ambassador to London, Mr. Leonid Zamyatin, is being called back to Moscow, apparently to explain why he spoke up in favor of the coup when it began last week. It's believed he's one of 30 ambassadors to be ordered home. Mr. Zamyatin will fly out on Friday. The embassy's official explanation is that it's usual diplomatic practice and could be connected with Mr. Major's visit to Moscow on Sunday.
9 days ago, and the nightmare scenario. Tanks rolling into Moscow, a new hardline junta at the Kremlin claiming power, a test of loyalty for ambassadors abroad. Leonid Zamyatin in London was called to the Foreign Office within hours. His chance to stand up for Gorbachev and Yeltsin. Instead, he put the knife in. First, he told reporters the coup was legal.
Action was in concrete fact, in accordance with 127 article of the Soviet Constitution and the law on the extraordinary situation in the Soviet Union.
Then Zamyatin justified the coup, blaming the economic crisis.
And the situation is aggravated more and more. And we haven't seen the way out, and that's why we need the extraordinary situation to improve that what the people expect from the Soviet leadership in the economy, in the social field.
Then he promoted the lie that Gorbachev was unwell and therefore unable to govern.
He is staying in Crimea. He was a little bit really tired from many things which have happened last time, and he needs a little bit to relax.
Zamyatin angered many at his embassy for failing to condemn the coup outright, then earned their distaste for his about-face when it collapsed.
This is a result of the first step of the reform of Gorbachev, that the people come and endorse the constitutional way of living.
In Dublin, another Soviet ambassador who sided with the conspirators was apologizing.
I lived through hell, torn between my innermost views and my official duty.
The one ambassador to condemn the coup was rewarded. Boris Pankin, Moscow's man in Prague, becomes the new Soviet foreign minister. He described the conspiracy from the word go as a fatal mistake. Announcing the recalls, Mr. Gorbachev said Soviet laws must be observed and those found guilty of supporting an unconstitutional act would bear the consequences.
The new people in Moscow, particularly those in the Russian parliament and the Russian government, will be wanting an image to be projected of the Soviet Union which is really in harmony with their aims. From their point of view, it makes sense. It makes sense that the real attitudes are displayed to the rest of the world, particularly at a time when there's so much anxiety about whose finger is on the Soviet nuclear button.
Mr. Zamyatin is said to have felt deeply humiliated in the aftermath of the coup. The official line is that he could return here after consultations in Moscow, but most people believe he'll be quietly sacked. Norman Rees, News at 10 at the Soviet Embassy.
The Prime Minister, Mr. Major, is arriving about now at President Bush's holiday home at Kennebunkport in Maine. They'll be discussing the Soviet Union and how the West can help. Mr. Major said the Soviet Union should not expect stacks of money, as he put it. He's been talking in Washington with the Defense Secretary, Mr. Cheney.
Mr. Major left Andrews Air Base, Washington this evening, hoping his journey to President Bush's holiday home will result in joint Western aid programs that will save the Soviet people from a winter of famine. Earlier on American television, he outlined his proposals to help the Russians help themselves.
What they need above all, I think, is perhaps assistance with food credits, assistance with distribution of food. They have a good deal of food, but it just doesn't get properly distributed. But it isn't just the question of providing what someone once called stacks of money. That is neither the best way to help nor is it the most immediate help that the Soviet Union needs.
A theme that was to be repeated in a round of the American TV breakfast shows.
I mean, they have a lot of food in the Soviet Union, but often they're absolutely unable to take it from one part of the Soviet Union to another. Assistance in moving the food around the Soviet Union is one of the areas we wish to look at.
The Prime Minister, who said today he believes the Soviet Union is on the brink of chaos, held a series of meetings